move her up the list. Yeah, some other kid gets kicked off. It's the way it goes. Now, Batson says, empathy there has led you to make the wrong decision. If it's a fair list, the list should stay. And if so, this would be a weakness of empathy. I think empathy really is like a spotlight. But spotlights have their problems. They have a narrow focus. They zoom in only on one person. If I was to care about all of you, that's not how empathy works. Empathy can make me care about you or you or you. Also, spotlights light up where we point them. We often point them in the wrong places. What I want to suggest then is because of this, empathy is biased, it's enumerate, it doesn't pay attention to numbers, even when numbers are important. It's concrete, it focuses on the immediate here and now without focusing on broader consequences, and it's myopic, it's short-sighted, saying basically the same thing. It just zooms in very narrowly. There's all sorts of ways I can give the example. I'm going to give the example, and these are going to be very American examples from my own upbringing. But I think, though, they're specific American examples. They will speak to you, and I bet you could find your own examples from your own experience. And what I'm giving you is examples of the sorts of things in my lifetime that people in the States got very, very interested in and very focused on. So one case is little children who get stuck in wells. For some reason, and I can't explain why, but every 10 years or so, a child gets stuck in a well, and it has to be rescued. We get intensely interested when this happens. We are very interested when people, particularly like teenagers, particularly attractive young teenagers, attractive white teenagers often, are the victims of crimes. That captivates the country. As in the case of Natalie Holloway, who was kidnapped and murdered while on vacation in Aruba. And what really captures our attention is mass shootings. My country has many mass shootings. This is a clip from what happened in Newtown, Connecticut, about 4 years ago, not far from where I live, where a killer went into an elementary school, murdered 20 children and 6 teachers. Now, these are very important, but you can ask, why these? Why these and not others? So the psychologist Paul Slovic, for instance, points out that when Natalie Holloway went missing, there were tens of thousands of children in Africa dying from famines, from war, and yet the network news in the United States devoted 13 more times coverage to this one person, Natalie Holloway, than to all of Africa. Or take mass shootings. Mass shootings are terrible. They're very significant and very important. But it turns out that in the United States, mass shootings are responsible for 0.1% of United States murders. That's such a small proportion that if you could snap your fingers and make it so that there'll never be a mass homicide again, nobody would ever notice you did so, looking at crime statistics. So why, if it's not the absolute importance in terms of suffering that makes us look at these things, what focuses us on them? What makes them so important? And I think part of the answer is when our feelings are involved, numbers don't matter anymore. And I'll illustrate this from an experiment done a long time ago. And it's part of the research program of Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work. And in this study, it's a very simple study, and again, you could do this in your own head. Sometimes there's oil spills. If there's an oil spill, often there's birds that get covered up with oil. And the birds have to be cleaned, or else they'll die. So you ask people, how much money would you spend to save the lives of 2,000 birds? So answer that in the privacy of your own head. How much money would you spend for that? And they asked people, and the answer they got in their study was 80 American dollars. Okay. I don't know if it's high, if it's low, but maybe your number was different. That's the answer they got. But then they asked another group of people, how much money would you spend to save the lives of 20,000 birds? And their answer was $78. And then they asked a third group, how much money would you spend to save the lives of 200,000 birds? And their answer was $88. And what they concluded was, people weren't paying attention to the numbers at all. When it comes to our feelings, the numbers don't matter. And that's one problem, because the numbers, when we think about it, the numbers really do matter. 200,000 birds is a lot more than 2,000 birds. 10,000 lives is 9,000 lives more than 1,000 lives. When we think about it, they matter. When we use our feelings, they don't. And then there's bias. This was a cartoon done at the height of the Ebola crisis. And it was used to bring people's attention to the fact that there was so much attention brought to the very few white victims of the crisis at the expense of the very many dark-skinned victims of the crisis. Capturing the fact that when it comes to our feelings, race matters, ethnicity matters. People are naturally drawn to care much more about the suffering of their own group than the suffering of other groups. And this shows up in all sorts of ways. All this racial bias. This is a classic study done in the States by Jennifer Eberhardt. And she found that if you hold everything equal in the criminal justice system, the type of crime, the background of the victim, the criminal record of the criminal, you are far more likely to be sentenced to death if you look like the man on the right than the man on the left. That we are strongly biased by racial factors. Or take this study. This is one of my favorite studies. It was done in Europe with soccer fans. And the way the experiment was done was the person sat and they have their brain being scanned. And then they're watching, and what they're watching is another man being shocked. And they're watching a man being shocked. And half the subjects are told, this man being shocked, he's a fan of your same soccer team. And for that group, the same parts of the brain are active. You wiggle, oh my God, you wiggle with him. But the other half were told, you see the man being shocked, he's a fan of the opposing soccer team. Now you don't get empathy. In fact, what you find is that areas of the brain that are devoted to pleasure light up as you watch him be shocked. So none of these problems, innumeracy or bias, are special to empathy. They're more general factors of our psychological and emotional lives. But empathy is particularly vulnerable to them. It's vulnerable to them because of its spotlight nature. Now I want to consider some objections. So here's one objection you could think of. Empathy might not be perfect, but it's always a force for good. It might, so maybe it's biased. Maybe it would lead me to help a white person over a dark-skinned person, a man over a woman, an American over a Korean. But still, at least I'm helping people. At least it's doing some good. But it doesn't always work that way. Let me first start with a hypothetical example. Imagine a vaccine program. And imagine this vaccine program was saving lives. By vaccinating children, it was saving 50 lives a year. But now imagine, due to some mistake, a little girl dies because of the vaccine. My bet is that you then stop the vaccine program. that people would demand that it be stopped. Even though, on balance, it's saving a lot more lives than it's harming. Even though stopping the program will lead to people dying. But the people dying are abstract and statistical. And empathy screams out in favor of the specific. Or take this example from the journalist Linda Pullman. She asked warlords of an African country a question nobody had ever asked them before. She asked them, why do you chop off the limbs of children? Just terrible atrocity. Why do you do it? And the answer she got was very surprising. The answer she got was, we do it for you. If we don't do atrocities, people from your country don't come. And when you come, you give us money and resources and food and so on. We want to make you come. Or take another example, that of child beggars. Children begging for food in parts of India and parts of Africa, it's terrible to see this. And as a rich, well-fed, affluent person, it's often impossible to resist giving money to them. But many people have argued that when you give money to them, you actually make the world worse. They're basically enslaved by adult criminals who take the money you give to them. And by giving them money, then you're supporting an organization that causes an enormous amount of suffering. The solution, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything, but if you give money to organizations like Oxfam, you can make the world much better. But giving money to these kids, as awful as it seems, makes the world worse. I was doing a radio interview in England many years ago on my last book about morality. And we were talking about charity, and I just read about this problem. So I mentioned it in a radio interview. And the other person who was being interviewed was this minister. And when I said this, she was shocked. She said to me, "That's terrible. That's the worst thing I've ever heard." When I see a child who's suffering, I help. I reach over and our hands touch, and there's a moment of intimate connection. Giving to Oxfam is cold and calculating, and I didn't know what to say. I'm very slow, and I don't like having confrontations. So I probably said, maybe you're right. But now, years later, I have my response. And my response is, it depends what you want. If what you want is to feel good about yourself, to have a rush of happiness, you should give to charity, particularly to children in front of you. In fact, as the philosopher Peter Singer says, the best way to increase your own pleasure is to give a lot of money, but spread it out for a little money to each of many, many, many charities. Like there's an enormous buffet, and you're plucking from each of the dishes just a little bit. That's how to really get a lot of pleasure. If you actually want to help people and make the world a better place, you should do something different. Now, I want to suggest that empathy can not only cause harm in this way, it could have much worse consequences. So I want us to consider for a minute atrocities. Atrocities like the Holocaust of Jews and other people in Europe in the early 1900s, and lynchings of African Americans in the South. Now, social psychologists and political scientists will tell you that these atrocities have all sorts of causes, and they do, dehumanization and cruelty and jealousy and in-group, out-group. But what I want to suggest is, one of the causes is empathy. Not empathy for the people you're killing, of course, but empathy for those who are said to be their victims. Whenever there's a movement to attack a group of people, what often provokes it are stories about the cruelties that this group of people have done to other individuals. There were stories told about blacks in the South raping white women. There were stories told about Jewish pedophiles preying on young German children. And these stories, and this is an insight from Adam Smith, when you hear these stories about victims and you feel empathy for the victims, it energizes you to want to strike back at those who have harmed them. And none of them, this is historical, is part of ancient history. I'll read the headline. The headline from this magazine from a few years ago is "Now They're Gassing Children. Chemical weapons kill 1,300." And it was, and the story of these weapons motivated the bombing of Syria. More recently, when Donald Trump did his own bombing, he said it was because of the videos he saw. They moved him. Should we ever, our country, my country, your country, other countries of the world, go into a full-scale war against ISIS, more and more of these videos will be used to show, to motivate people to want to go to war. Now, I'm not a pacifist. Sometimes going to war might be the right thing. But empathy pushes us too much with a desire to punish, a desire to hurt. And it's too easily used by demagogues who want to make people go to war. In collaboration with one of my students, Nick Stignaro, I did some experiments on this. I'll just tell you about one of them. We told people stories about an atrocity. A journalists were kidnapped in a faraway country. They were tortured and they were murdered. And we told a story in some detail to get them to feel empathy for these victims. Then we asked, what should America do in response? And we gave answers on a continuum. They could say nothing. America should do nothing. They should do criticism. They should slow down foreign aid. They should stop foreign aid. They should threaten military action. They should have airstrikes, or they should invade. And then we also measured how empathic they are. Because people differ in their empathy. So we gave people an empathy scale to see how empathic they are. And what we found, as predicted, was the more empathy they had, the more willing they were to have a violent reprisal. And so if somebody tells you empathy is always on the side of helping the world and being kind to people, tell them about these data. Tell them that empathy can often drive people towards a violent impulse. Okay, suppose I convinced you that empathy has some problems with foreign policy. Still, you might say, well, but it's essential for certain valuable relationships, like between a doctor and a patient. And I have a cartoon here. He says to the other guy, it helps me empathize, because he also has his pants down. It's my favorite cartoon in the world. And you might think that doctors should feel empathy for their patients. Now, again, it depends what you mean by empathy. If you mean they should care about their patients, sure. If you mean they should try to understand their patients, absolutely. If you mean they should show respect for their patients, definitely. But should they feel the pain of their patients? Should they experience what their patients are experiencing? I think then it gets more complicated when it comes to therapy. Psychiatrists and therapists and psychologists, where it's very important if you see somebody for mental illness or for depression or for anxiety, for that person to understand you and for that person to care about you. Nobody would deny that that's important. But you're not understanding therapy right if you think that person has to feel what you feel. On the contrary, that would make them very bad at what they do. If I go to my therapist and I say, I'm so depressed, I'm terribly sad, I don't want her to start crying. I want her to look at me and try to figure out what's wrong with me and try to help me without the problems of my emotions. If she gets upset when dealing with me, now I have two problems, not just one. I think, by the way, to add this, that this is the same with parents. So, suppose you're a parent of a child, and your child is very upset about something. So for me, I won't tell you the name of my child who did this, because he'll get upset, because it's on TV. But he comes to me and says, I haven't done my homework for tomorrow, and he's very upset. And I say, okay, you'll just do it now. And he says, but I was supposed to work on that for the last month. So he's very upset. I am not at my best as a parent if I get upset too. If I get, oh my God, this is terrible. I'm at my best as a parent with my kids when I say, I love you, I care for you, let's try to make the situation better. And in general, in relationships, we're often at our best when we don't get caught up in other person's feelings, particularly if they're bad feelings, like sadness or anxiety. The third argument, you could say, look, I'm arguing against empathy, but aren't people with low empathy terrible? You might think of a psychopathic killer, like the star of the movie Silence of the Lambs. Or in general, you might think of psychopaths. So this is a test. It's a list of the symptoms that go with being a psychopath. I won't read them to you. They're things like pathological lying, lack of guilt, low self-control, early behavioral problems, and yes, lack of empathy. It is true that psychopaths lack empathy. But let me tell you two things about that. One thing is, it's true psychopaths lack empathy. But it's also true that people with autism or Asperger's syndrome, by the very same measures, also lack empathy. But they're not cruel people. And so it seems like lacking empathy does not automatically make you bad. But here's the other thing. There were studies that asked the question, which sort of psychopaths go on to commit criminal acts? Which go on to do terrible things? And it turns out that lack of empathy has no predictive power at all. The factors that have to do with whether or not a psychopath is going to go on to make trouble later on isn't lack of empathy. The factors are lack of self-control, impulsivity, and a history of violence. In fact, the best predictor of whether a psychopath who's released from prison will commit a violent crime is whether or not he was there for a violent crime in the first place. Now you could say, oh, that's psychopaths. Who cares about psychopaths? But it's true for the rest of us as well. Now finally, it's often said that, well, we need empathy. Without empathy, why would we do good? Why would we ever help the world? Why would we make the world a better place? I hear that a lot, but it seems to me to reflect a failure of imagination. Think about the good things you've done. Helping a friend, giving to charity, going out of your way to volunteer for something, a kind word to somebody who was sad. Maybe you were motivated by empathy, feeling what they were feeling. But you don't have to be. It seems strange to say that if you give money to help out children dying in a famine, starving children, you have to feel what it's like to be starving. Seems nuts. You could just say, that's terrible, I want to help. In fact, there's a difference between emotion in general and the role of reason or rationality in figuring out what makes us a good person. And this brings us back to our hero, Adam Smith. So Adam Smith gave a famous example. I'm going to change it slightly to make it more modern or more clear. But he says, how would you feel if you heard that thousands of people died in a faraway country? And what he said was, you'd say, okay, that's too bad, it's awful. Then he said, so hold that in your mind, how would you feel if tomorrow you're going to have your little finger chopped off? He said, you wouldn't sleep tonight. It'd be very upsetting. So ask yourself, which is more emotionally upsetting? Losing your finger or 1,000 people dying? It's obvious, losing your finger. Now ask yourself, would you rather have 1,000 people die rather than lose your little finger? Now, I've never had the courage to ask people to raise their hand to give an answer. But I imagine people could recognize, intellectually at least, that the lives of thousands of people matter a lot more than a little finger. And how do we explain this? And Smith says, it's not our emotions. And he describes it in very flowery terms. It's not the soft power of humanity. It's not that feeble spark of benevolence which nature has lifted up in the human heart. Rather, it is reason, principle, conscience that calls to us with a voice capable of astonishing the most presumptuous of our passions, that we are but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other in it. And this part is what philosophers call impartiality. The idea that I love my child so much, and you there and back, I don't even know you. I don't love you. But I recognize that the life of my child matters as much as your life. That from the standpoint, stepping back, even though I know some of you and don't know others, and there's people I love and people who are strangers, stepping back for us to be truly moral involves an attitude of impartiality and distance. And this is the foundation of religions and philosophies. This is research in an amazing collaboration between the neuroscientist Tanya Singer and the Buddhist monk and biologist Matthew Ricard. And what they did was, they put people in a brain scanner and they got them to either feel empathy towards other people or they got them to feel compassion towards other people. And they summarized the results like this. Compassion is an other-related emotion. It connects to other people. It's linked to positive feelings like love. It leads to good health and approach and kindness. But empathy, they argued, leads to empathic distress, which is a self-related emotion, leads to negative feelings like stress, poor health and burnout, and withdrawal and non-social behavior. Now, I've argued against empathy, but I'm only against empathy when it comes to moral behavior, moral decision-making, and moral guidance. Empathy has other advantages. This is my son, Zachary, who I will admit is the same one who didn't do his homework. And he is having a great time. And when I took this picture, I was having a great time too. In part because I love him and it was nice to see him happy, but in part because I put myself in his shoes and I felt what he was feeling. And empathy could be a great source of pleasure like that, because you could feel the pleasures of other people. You could have children and enjoy what it's like all over again to have your first ice cream cone, to see fireworks for the first time. You can enjoy through the pleasure of feeling empathy for fictional characters. One of the great pleasures of life, reading and movies and television, where so much of what the pleasure is imagining yourself in another person's shoes. I would not, if you ask me, would I make empathy go away? Absolutely not. Because empathy is a wonderful source of pleasure. Now at this point, there's a final argument you might make in favor of empathy, which is in fiction, when we read fiction and feel empathy for others, it might zoom us in and make us care. So the philosopher Martha Nussbaum gives an example of Greek tragedies. And she writes, although all of the future citizens who saw ancient tragedies were male, they were asked to have empathy for the suffering of many whose lot could never be theirs, such as Trojans and Persians and Africans, such as wives and daughters and mothers. And through history, say through American history, this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a work of fiction, but it got its readers at the time, who were mostly white people, many of them slave owners, to imagine what it's like to be a slave, to put themselves in the shoes of a slave. And arguably, this caused a great social good. And so our TV programs now that, for instance, get people to imagine what it's like to feel empathy for characters who are of a different sexuality than they are. So, empathy can do good. And empathy for fictional characters can do good. I'd be wrong to deny that. But I think people too quickly ignore other fictional engagement with characters that can have a less positive role. This is my favorite book in the world. It's Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. And those of you who, I envy those of you who haven't read it yet, because now you have the chance to read it. And it's the story of an older man's pursuit of basically a prepubescent girl, his sexual pursuit. And he is a monster. But I dare you to get more than 20 pages in the book without feeling empathy for him, without putting yourself in his shoes and adopting his goals as if they were your own. So the problem with empathy for fictional characters is it can drive you to feel for a good person, but also feel for a bad person. And so for every Uncle Tom's Cabin, which gets you to feel empathy for slaves, there's a book like Hitler's Mein Kampf, who gets you to feel empathy for those who would create concentration camps. For every Schindler's List that gets you to feel empathy for the victims of the Holocaust, there's a movie like Birth of a Nation, which gets you to feel empathy for terrible racist characters who are trying to exterminate blacks. I hate terminological arguments. I hate arguments about semantics and about words. I don't care how you use the word empathy. And I don't care how you use the Korean word that means empathy in English. There's all sorts of meanings of that word which are totally okay. I'm not talking about a word here. I'm talking, and so for instance, if you want to use empathy to mean concern, compassion, kindness, love, morality, that's wonderful. What I'm talking about is a very specific notion. I'm talking about the act of putting yourself in another person's shoes, feeling what they feel, being one with them. I agree, I would insist that this is a wonderful source of pleasure and happiness, and it enriches our lives. But I also think when it comes to motivating us to do good things, and when it comes to helping us make decisions about right and wrong, doing the right thing, it is terrible. It is a moral train wreck. So I'm against empathy, and I hope I can encourage the rest of you to be against empathy with me. Thank you.
대처할 수 있는 무기 한 가지를 꼽자고 한다면 창의성이다. 반갑습니다. 귀한 시간 내서 추운 날 여기까지 찾아오신 여러분들에게 2시간이 헛되지 않도록 제가 인생 강의를 열심히 해보고자 합니다. 오늘 제가 이제 시작하려고 하는 첫 주제는 4차 산업혁명입니다. 여러분들이 이제 한국에서 사시려고 하면 피해갈 수 없는 그런 주제일 것 같습니다. 이 4차 산업혁명은 2016년에 그 다보스 포럼에서 클라우스 슈밥 교수가 얘기한 이후에 전 세계적으로 많은 관심을 받고 있는 그런 것이죠. 구글에서 빅데이터 분석을 한 구글 트렌드라고 하는 기능이 있습니다. 이 기능을 통해서 4차 산업혁명에 대해서 사람들이 얼마나 많은 관심을 가지고 있나 전 세계적으로 검색 수를 가지고 그림을 그렸는데요. 보시면 알겠지만 많은 선진국에서 관심을 많이 보이고 있습니다. 그 중에서도 제일 많이 검색을 하고 있는 나라가 대한민국입니다. 우리가 네이버에서 검색수에서 보는 것처럼 작년 이후에 지속적으로 검색수가 증가해 나가고 있습니다. 그 정점을 이룬 것은 아마 우리 문재인 대통령께서 참석하신 가운데 열렸던 4차 산업혁명위원회의 조직이라고 할 수 있습니다. 박근혜 정부가 창조 경제라고 하는 걸 통해서 경제를 이끌어가는 어떤 슬로건으로 삼았다고 한다면 이번 문재인 정부에서는 4차 산업혁명을 어떻게 대비하고 성공적으로 이끌어갈 것이냐라고 하는 것이 경제의 큰 기조가 되어지고 있습니다. 4차 산업혁명이 궁금했어요. 그래서 항상 제가 해오듯이 검색을 했습니다. 4차 산까지만 네이버에 집어넣는데 관련 검색어들이 이렇게 계속 뜨고 있습니다. 그 중에서 제 눈길을 잡았던 관련어는 보시는 것처럼 이런 거예요. 4차 산업혁명 직업, 일자리, 4차 산업혁명 시대에 살아남기 이런 것입니다. 많은 사람들이 4차 산업혁명에 대한 내용은 잘 모른다 할지라도 궁금해하는 내용이 있죠. 이건 컴퓨터나 AI가 내가 갖고 있는 직업, 앞으로 향후에 내가 하게 될 수 있는 직업을 뺏어가면 어떻게 되나라고 하는 그런 걱정들이 있습니다. 그래서 취준생들이 가장 많은 질문이 이 4차 산업혁명이 오면 일자리가 더 없어질까요? 라고 하는 질문입니다. 오늘 이 시간에 이러한 우려와 걱정에 대해서 같이 답을 찾아보는 그런 시간이 되었으면 좋겠습니다. 4차 산업혁명의 키워드가 뭘까요? 제가 찾아보니까 인공지능, 사물인터넷, 빅데이터, 융합 이런 키워드들이 4차 산업혁명과 쌍을 이어서 나타나고 있습니다. 우리 이세돌 구단을 괴롭혔었던 알파고죠. 이 알파고의 알파고를 제작한 딥마인드라고 하는 회사에서 공개를 했습니다. 저도 잘 모르지만 보면 이런 알고리즘을 갖고 있다고 해요. 어떤 수가 하나 두어지고 나면 다음 수는 최고의 승률을 보장해주는, 확률적으로 보장해주는 다음 수가 한 250개 정도가 나오고요. 그 중에서 최고의 확률을 갖고 있는 수와 연결이 되고 그 수가 또 놓여지게 되면 또다시 250개의 수가 나타나는 이런 식으로 기하급수적으로 수가 늘어나면서 점들이 연결이 되는 것, 이것이 알파고의 알고리즘이라고 합니다. 두 번째가 사물인터넷이에요. 사물인터넷이라고 하는 건 문자 그대로 사물들이 인터넷과 연결이 된다, 이런 뜻으로 생각해 볼 수 있을 것 같습니다. 또 이 중에 몇 분은 틀림없이 오늘 집에 강연에 오시기 전에 집에 있는 전기불을 또는 가스불을 안 잠궜거나 안 껐거나 하는 걱정을 하시는 분이 계실 수도 있을 것 같아요. 이제 앞으로는 그런 걱정을 하실 필요가 없다는 거죠. 우리에게 그런 신호가 오니까요. 그러니까 사물 인터넷이라고 하는 건 온라인과 오프라인의 서로 연결이다. 우리가 이렇게 생각해 볼 수도 있을 것 같습니다. 이거는 빅데이터예요. 이 빅데이터 분석의 결과인데 우리가 음악의 아버지는 바하라고 합니다. 그런 얘기는 많이 들어보셨을 것 같습니다. 이 그림이 음악의 아버지 바하를 보여주는 어떤 실증 자료라고 할 수 있을 것 같은데, 보라색으로 보이는 점들이 바로크 시대의 음악가들이라고 합니다. 이 빅데이터는 세계적인 음반 회사에서 팔리는 음반의 개수들을 통해서 축적된 빅데이터를 카르스트에 있는 어떤 교수님께서 분석을 해주신 건데, 예를 들어서 바로크 시대 음반을 어떤 회사에서 만들어 판다. 그러면 그 음반에 실려 있는 작곡가들은 서로 관련이 있다고 우리가 생각해 볼 수 있죠, 그죠? 그리고 그 CD를 산 사람이 또 다른 클래식 음악을 샀다 그러면 그 사람의 음악끼리 서로 관련이 있다고 생각해 볼 수 있을 것 같아요. 이런 자료들이 엄청나게 축적이 되고 난 다음에 분석을 해보니까 평균적으로 세계에 있는 작곡가들은 한 15명과 서로 직간접인 교류를 맺고 있다라고 이렇게 얘기할 수 있다고 합니다. 근데 지금 보여지는 바하 같은 경우는 무려 1,500명의 작곡가와 직간접적인 영향을 맺고 있다라고 하는 사실이 밝혀졌어요. 그러니까 보통 일반 작곡가들보다 한 100배 정도가 되는 소셜 네트워크를 작곡가들 사이에서 갖고 있다는 거죠. 그러니까 아마 우리가 바하가 음악의 아버지다라고 하는 내용, 그러니까 흔히 하는 내용이지만 빅데이터는 이런 사실을 여기 보여줄 수 있습니다. 그 다음에 보여주는 것이 융합인데요. 2015년도 교과부에서는 우리나라 글로벌 인재를 끌고 나갈 수 있는 교육의 기조를 창의 융합 교육이라고 이름을 붙였습니다. 이 창의 융합 교육이라고 하는 것, STEAM 또는 STEM 교육이라고도 하는 건데요. 이거는 Science, Technology, Engineering, Art, Math의 첫 자를 따서 만든 거죠. 그러니까 우리가 특정 주제를 가르치는데 한 학문을 통해서 가르치는 것보다는 여러 가지 재학문들의 결합을 통해서 특정 주제를 가르치게 되면 그 시너지 효과가 또는 학생들의 흥미를 유도하는 효과가 더욱 클 거다라고 하는 사실입니다. 예를 들어 아트다 그러면 점묘법, 그렇죠? 점으로 찍어서 보여지는 것, 그런 것들, 또 무대 조명, 지금도 저에게 비춰지고 있는 무대 조명, 이런 것들도 빛과 색채에 관련된 것들이죠. 이것이 기술 영역으로 넘어간다 그러면 디지털 카메라라든가 LCD 화면 같은 것들이 될 수가 있고요. 또 과학으로 또 응용이 된다고 한다면은 3D 기술을 통해서 아바타와 같은 영화라든가 또는 의학에서 사용하고 있는 3D 어떤 이미지 같은 것들을 우리가 같이 빛과 색채라고 하는 주제 안에 묶을 수가 있는데, 이런 것이 교과서에 따로따로 실리는 게 아니라 한 주제로 실리게 된다면 학생들에게 관심을 유발하고 또 창의적인 아이디어를 만들어낼 수 있는 가능성이 더 높아지지 않을까, 그런 생각을 해보는 겁니다. 이것이 창의융합 교육의 핵심 화두라고 할 수 있어요. 제가 아는 만큼 4차 산업혁명의 키워드에 관해서 특징들을 여러분에게 말씀드렸는데, 자, 그러면 어떤 공통점이 있을까요? 여기에서는 네, 연결이죠. 연결. 제가 찾아본 게 연결인 것 같아요. 4차 산업혁명의 공통점은 연결인 것 같습니다. 연결이라고 하는 거를 하는 능력을 우리가 뭐라고 부르는가? 제가 뭐라고 얘기하면은 여러분들께서 그냥 한 귀로 듣고 흘리시겠지만, 이 사람이 얘기한다 그러면 좀 달라지겠죠. 이 사람이 뭐라고 얘기하냐면 딴딴딴은 사물을 연결하는 능력이다, 이렇게 얘기했어요. 이 물음표가 뭘까요? creativity. Creativity is just connecting things. 스티브 잡스가 한 얘기. 창의성이라고 하는 것, 사물과 사물을 연결하는 거라고 볼 수 있어요. 물론 우리가 바늘과 실, 숟가락과 젓가락, 이런 연결은 그렇게 창의적이라고 하지는 않아요. 그러나 국가꽃을 보고 소쩍새와 연결을 시킨다 그러면 이건 좀 창의적이다, 우리가 얘기할 수 있는 거죠. 그래서 우리가 국화 옆에서 소쩍새, 국화를 피우기 위해서 소쩍새가 봄부터 울었나 보다, 이 두 가지가 연결이 되고 있는 상황, 우리가 창의성이라고 합니다. 창의성의 정의는 굉장히 다양하지만 우리가 서로 관련이 되어 있지 않은 것처럼 보이는 두 가지 사물을 강제로 결합시키는 거다라고 우리가 정의를 내린다고 하면 창의성이라고 하는 것이 4차 산업혁명에 필요한 그러한 능력이다라고 하는 걸 우리가 한번 더 확인해 볼 수 있는 거죠. 4차 산업혁명의 특징이 공통점이 이 사물을 연결시키는 거라고 우리가 얘기를 하게 되면 그것을 할 수 있는 능력이 창의성이고, 그렇다고 한다면 앞으로 우리가 일자리에 대한 걱정을 할 때 창의성이라고 하는 능력을 내가 발휘하면 일자리에 대한 걱정은 좀 줄어들 수 있겠다라고 우리가 일단 한번 답을 내려볼 수도 있겠죠. 이런 유사한 연구가 하나가 더 있습니다. 이게 최근 들어서 여러분들 많이 보도되고 있는 연구 중에 하나가 컴퓨터나 AI가 우리 직업을 얼마나 뺏어갈 것이냐라고 하는 그런 질문들이에요. 이 연구를 한 사람이 옥스퍼드 대학의